All right, let's get started tonight. So tonight's topic is going to be, I don't know if I told you guys this or not, but like part of the project for a class I have is that I'm going to be tackling 3 most popular apologetic questions that most Christians are dealt with. So this is kind of going to be the first one of 3, and it's going to be, is the New Testament historically reliable? And we're going to kind of go into what that actually means. I don't know if you guys know what that means or not, but we're going to talk a lot about it. But before we start, can somebody pray for us? Does anyone want to? Sebastian, go for it.
Dear God, I just thank you for our time tonight and everybody here that was able to make it. Just speak through Luke, Father, that you would speak into us through him, and whatever he has for us, Father, that we would just be able to take what you have and apply it and just live it out and be with the rest of our night. And we give all these things in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Okay, so starting on. So just the introduction to what we're talking about tonight. So is the New Testament historically reliable? And we're going to, right now in this slide at least, going to be talking about, like, why is this important? Like, why do we need to tackle the subject? So I predicted myself. Why is this important? So this topic leads us to questions such as, can I trust what's in my Bible? So looking at the New Testament, like if the authors of the New Testament claim they were eyewitnesses, but they really weren't, and it was written 200 years later, like that causes problems, obviously, because it's someone who's claiming one thing and it's something completely different. So can I trust what's in my Bible? How do I know my Bible today is what the original authors wrote? I think this is one of the biggest things is and we'll bring up a skeptic in the future part of this presentation where they claim that we don't have what the original authors actually wrote. Like, we don't have the paper it's not paper, but we don't have the manuscript that John wrote himself. We only have the copies of the copies. And is that a problem? And obviously we want to get as close as we can to the original manuscripts. We want, our Bibles today, if it's exactly what John wrote, that's good. That's what we want. So it leads us to ask that type of question. When was the New Testament written? Kind of what I talked about earlier. If it was written 200 years after these events and they're claiming they're eyewitnesses, but they're really not, that causes problems as well. So when was it written? Was it written within the time frame of the witnesses, of the eyewitnesses, within their lifetime, or was it after? How does the New Testament's historical reliability compare to other historical documents? So we're going to be putting the New Testament with, and we're going to kind of compare that with other historical documents as well, such as, I don't know if you guys have heard of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Have you guys heard that book? So that's a super classic ancient text. It's by Homer. So we'll be comparing that type of stuff as well. So kind of the introduction and overview of what we're doing tonight. By the way, I do have handouts for you guys. I do, because it's a super nice grad project. So I made handouts, but I'll be doing that. I'll probably print them at the end for you. You can take them home, and it's just going to be a summary of what I talk about here. So an overview of what we're talking about. So we're going to talk about the dates of the New Testament documents. So when were they written? And we're going to go specifically in the Gospels because those are the most important. But we'll talk about some other New Testament documents as well. Not all of them though, because we could spend one whole night doing that. New Testament manuscripts. We'll talk about what that is. Pretty much the manuscripts are the copies of the copies. So we'll go into those specific ones. Early church fathers, so the early church fathers, we're going to be going into kind of what they wrote, and who the early church fathers were the people who outlived the disciples. So it's the disciples of the disciples. So the next generation of Christians after the original 12. Textual criticism, I'm not expecting you to know what that means right now, but we'll get into it and we'll describe it when we get there. And we'll talk about the authors themselves. So did Mark actually write Mark? And were they eyewitnesses and stuff like that? So looking into the dates of the New Testament books written, starting with Matthew. So there's certain ways, and there's going to be a graph in the future in the next couple slides that will show kind of a timeline of when certain New Testament books were written. And we'll talk about kind of how we know which ones, how do they date these. So right now though, Matthew, by Christian scholars, is from the 60s to the 80s. Liberal dating, so if you're a critical scholar, they date them a little bit later. Same thing with Mark. Not the same thing with Mark. It's going to be the same thing with Luke. But Mark is written the late 50s to the late 60s. So pretty much all scholars think Mark was the first gospel written. And then after that, it was Matthew and Luke. So Matthew and Luke are very similar in that they were written in the early 60s to the sometime in the 80s. There's reasons for that, and we'll talk about that a little later. Liberal dating, 70 to 110. Looking at John, it was written probably sometime between the 60s to 100. So there's a huge time gap there, and that's because it's a lot different than the other Gospels. It's probably written after the other Gospels. It might not have been, but that one's kind of one that's like not for sure known, but it's for sure before the year 100. And then Acts is a really interesting one. And Acts was probably written somewhere between 62 and 64. And the reason why it's so specific, there's multitude of reasons. One of the first reasons is, like if you've read the book of Acts, it's like stops at chapter 28 and it looks like it just falls off a cliff. Like it's just like there's a story, this narrative, and all of a sudden it's like Paul was in Rome 2 years and then the book just ends. So it looks like it ends historically from that standpoint, because that was like Luke was telling the story up until the present day when he was writing it. So that was probably what happened. Another reason why it was probably written in certain this time frame is it doesn't mention Paul's death, and Paul probably died in like 66 AD, 65, 66. It doesn't mention that at all. So it was probably written before. There's some other reasons too, like it was probably written, it doesn't mention the destruction of Jerusalem, which was like outside of Jesus' resurrection and death. That was the second most important event in the first century. And it doesn't mention that at all. So there's more reasons too. If you want to know more, just let me know after. We can go through them. But Acts was probably written during that very narrow time frame. So then going on to stuff outside the Gospels now, or the first 5 books of the New Testament. Galatians and 1 Thessalonians were probably the first books written outside of the Gospels. So like the late 40s and to the early 50s. And like the reason, like this is, like historically speaking, this is very, very like short time frame between Jesus' death and resurrection to when these were written. Like this is like 20 years or less, which is insane historically. Like usually historical documents there, like historians are talking about certain events like maybe 100 years or more after them. This is like 20 or less. So the reason why we're going over the dates in the New Testament written is because like the people who are writing these books claim to be eyewitnesses, and because of that, they lived within the time period of like Jesus, and like they claim that they saw these things, they claim that they saw these miracles. So like if these books were written within that time frame, then that means they're reliable. Like they are eyewitnesses, and they're just telling what they experienced themselves. And then Revelation was probably most likely like 99% the last book written in the New Testament. Somewhere between 90 to 96. And then all the other New Testament books are somewhere in between these. So probably between like the 90s, so from like the 40s to the 90s, all of the New Testament was written. So here is some sweet graph that I made. It took me like 45 minutes to make, but it's cool. I like it. It's cool. So this is like, all the way on the left is Jesus' death and resurrection, 33 AD. And then we just have 100 over on the right. And then these are just like the books that we talked about. So Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, somewhere around 50. And then we have Mark. So Mark was the first one written, and then Matthew and Luke. And the reason why people know, or why scholars think this, is because if you read Mark is it's shorter than the other Gospels, and it's very like concise. If you read it, it's kind of like, I've heard it be compared to like a child kind of using run-on sentences, like, and then I went to the store, and then we like got soda, and then we got ice cream, and then this, and then like that's kind of like, if you read Mark's gospel, it kind of has that vibe. And I think that's also because too, his mother tongue or his heart language was Aramaic, and he was writing in Greek, and apparently that's like really good. This is what I've heard from someone. That's like the way he writes is really good Hebrew, but terrible Greek. So like there's that like, and then Jesus went and did this, and then he did that, and then he did this, and then he did that. So Mark is kind of like very concise in that. And then looking at Matthew and Luke, both Matthew and Luke, about 90% of what's in Mark is in both Matthew and Luke. So what people conclude then is when Matthew and Luke were writing their Gospels, they probably had Mark in front of them. and they were like, oh, like, so here's this story, but let me add a couple details that didn't, that like they didn't add or whatever. So then Matthew and Luke, and then Acts was written straight after because of the reasons that we did, or that I said before.